All right, everyone. So it is basically Christmas. And in the time of Christmas, we talk about the birth of Christ. And in talking about the birth of Christ, we naturally go into the life of Christ. And eventually we go into the death of Christ. Now, Christ conquered death. So his life, albeit it is tragic at the surface, it is actually one of hope and inspiration and comfort and consolation. And in the story of the murder of Christ, because we talk about the death of Christ, well, how did Christ die? He died a very brutal death, crucifixion. He was nailed onto a cross. I mean, just the sound of that sounds absolutely excruciating. Christ was murdered. He was murdered in a very brutal and cruel fashion. And the people who murdered Christ, they were running a mini theocracy. It was a mini theocracy under the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire allowed for the theocracy to be done because, well, that was a way that Rome kept the peace in its territories. It allowed for the native subjects, the native populations in the lands that were subject to the Roman Empire, to observe their own laws. And so, according to the Sanhedrin, Jesus was a lawbreaker in accordance to their religion. And what the Sanhedrin did was obviously very, very evil. What eventually happened after the resurrection? Well, what happened was exactly what Christ warned about. He warned the people that eventually the temple would be destroyed. And he also warned the people that, well, he told them, don't weep for me. There were some women who were weeping for Christ while he was carrying his cross, and he said, don't weep for me, but basically weep for your children. Weep for those who are going to be alive in the future because, well, the Jewish people are going to go through hell. And that's what happened. The Jewish people went through hell in the Roman-Judean War. Now, there wasn't just war that took place. There was also famine that took place in Judea, and this famine wiped out so many people living in Judea. Now, how did this famine happen? Well, when you read about the Roman-Judean War, there was a lot of granaries that were destroyed. And why were the granaries destroyed? Did the Romans destroy them? No, the Romans did not destroy the granaries. The granaries were destroyed by the opposing Jewish factions. They were opposing Jewish factions that destroyed each other's granaries in order to starve one another. Yes. So it's amazing. People talk about Jewish unity, Jewish pride, how the Jews are just so much together. And when they talk about their history, they will just stick to, let me just rephrase that. They will focus a lot on Masada. They will focus a lot on Masada. What happened in Masada? Masada was when basically you had the last outpost of Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire. Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire. So the Romans said, okay, let's go sweep up this last unit of Jewish rebels, this last group of Jewish rebels, and that'll be it. The war will be over, and we can just stop dealing with this insanity. So they went over to Masada. Masada was a giant fortress which was erected by Herod. And the reason why Herod erected the fortress of Masada was because he knew that there were a lot of people who were very rebellious, a lot of Judeans who were very rebellious people. And so he knew, well, if the people ever rose up against me, I will just find refuge in Masada. Masada was a very, very powerful citadel. It had tons of food, garbanzo beans, grain, basically stuff the Middle Eastern people eat, and lentils, which is another very common ingredient used in Middle Eastern cuisine. So even, in those days, Middle Eastern people, Jews not exempt, ate pretty much the same stuff. And he had enough food in this fortress. He made sure that there would be enough food in Masada to feed an army of thousands upon thousands of men, tens of thousands of men. So there was plenty of food. Masada was basically carved out of a mountain. So it was carved out of rock. So it was pretty solid. If you were going to try to maintain a final stand, Masada was an ideal position. But when the Romans arrived, well, none of that really mattered because the people inside of Masada decided to just kill themselves. It's very interesting. They took Masada as an outpost because they thought that, well, Masada, and their thought process wasn't wrong, Masada would be a perfect place to fight an enemy army. Because from Masada, you can hide. You have plenty of food to last you for a long time. You can really, really maintain a prolonged fight. But they didn't really use Masada to their advantage. They decided to commit suicide because some rabbi told them, you guys are a bunch of weaklings. Yes, you can read the speech. It's in Josephus's History on the Roman-Judean War. There was a rabbi who was the leading rabbi inside of Masada, and he just went up to them and gave them this grand speech. And he said, you guys are a bunch of cowards because you don't want to commit suicide. Yeah, talk about cult manipulation. It was like one of those self-help gurus from YouTube, the ones who tell you that you're a coward and that you're a weakling and you're a soy boy and you're a cuck. And if you want to be strong, then, buy my $500 1-month program or something like that. It was basically the rabbinic equivalent to that in Masada in ancient times. And he said, you guys are a bunch of cowards. And, people, and this is what he told them, people back in India, they don't mind killing themselves. And he said that Hindus will burn themselves alive. So if Hindus, yes, the world was a lot more international than you think. People weren't as isolated as you think. People think, well, back in ancient times, everybody was just so isolated. No, they weren't. People were very internationally aware in those days. And so he said, if Hindus who are pagans have the courage to burn themselves alive, why don't we have the courage to commit mass suicide? Yeah, this is what he said. This was his argument. And he said that if we don't kill ourselves, then we're going to be subject to the Roman Empire, and we're going to be slaves to Rome. And Rome is evil. We're not evil. We're the good guys. But Rome is just pure evil, guys. And so when the Romans came, the Romans were expecting quite a tenacious resistance because, they were in this giant stone citadel, but there was no resistance. And the Romans thought to themselves, well, it's a little bit too quiet here. So they went inside of Masada. They just walked in and they saw a bunch of dead people. And they found some people who were still alive. And so they inquired what happened here. And these people explained to the soldiers that there was a massive cult suicide that occurred here, and that they tried to pressure us to kill ourselves, but we didn't. We didn't do it. And that there were other people who did not want to commit suicide, but they were murdered. So what happened in Masada was Jonestown. That's what happened. Jonestown. You had Jim Jones who came out and said, we got to kill ourselves because if we don't, then our children are going to suffer under the evil U.S. government. And that was obviously a lie. But there were people who believed it, and so they killed themselves. And then the people in Jonestown who didn't want to commit suicide, they were murdered. Yeah, they were murdered. A lot of them actually were murdered. And you can see the video from Jonestown, the aftermath of the cult suicide. You can see hundreds of dead people. It's pretty horrific. A lot of those people were murdered. I mean, they were all murdered, right? Suicide is self-murder at the end of the day, but there were people who were murdered not by suicide. And so that's what happened in Masada. There were people who committed suicide, and there were people who were murdered because they didn't want to commit suicide. So isn't it interesting that when Jesus was walking the earth, they hated him because he did not want to foment a rebellion against Rome. And then they accused him of being an enemy to the Caesar, and that's why when they were in front of Pontius Pilate, they tried to pressure Pontius Pilate, and they succeeded in doing so. They pressured Pontius Pilate to crucify Jesus, to have Jesus crucified, and they did so by simply saying that this man is an enemy of the Caesar, and we all know what happens to enemies of the Caesar, and we have no king but Caesar, and so basically, hint, hint, Pontius Pilate, if you don't kill him, then you are compliant in the crime of sedition. So Pontius Pilate thought, well, if I don't have this man executed, then these people are going to go to Caesar and tell him, and Caesar's going to say, well, Pontius Pilate, why didn't you do anything? And then it could be Pilate being killed. So Pilate, coming from a place of self-preservation, acquiesced to the mob and had Jesus crucified. And then what happened to a lot of the people in Judea? A lot of the Judeans themselves, well, they were crucified. The Roman Empire crucified tens of thousands of Judeans as a way to stop rebellion. And also a lot of the Judeans killed one another and destroyed themselves and committed suicide. Judas betrayed Christ for some money and then ended up destroying himself. And what happened to a lot of the Judeans? They ended up destroying themselves. And that's why they destroyed their own granaries. That's why there was massive starvation. It wasn't because it just so happened there was no wheat. There was plenty of wheat in Jerusalem. But the Jews began to kill one another, and they decided to destroy each other's granaries. Well, why were they killing one another? Well, it was between two different political opinions. You had one side who said, well, we really don't want war with the Romans. And there was another side who said, no, we do want war with the Romans. And if you don't want war with the Romans, then you are an enemy to the Jewish people. You are not even a true Jew, and you should be killed. And what do we see today? We talk about Christmas. We talk about the birth of Christ. But in talking about the birth of Christ, we are naturally led to the death or murder of Christ. And just as King Solomon tells us, there is nothing new under the sun. And what happened in the past will happen again. Well, what's happening in Israel? A lot of people want to go back to the Sanhedrin. And they are opposing views in Israel that are becoming so bad that it's leading to, well, a violent confrontation. And if you look at the current government in Israel, you have the Likud Party. And the Likud Party, well, the Likud Party was known in the past as one that could make alliances with other parties that were not as conservative. Netanyahu was known as someone who could make ties with other parties that were more to the center. But if you look at the coalition that the Likud Party is in right now, it's in a coalition with parties who want to bring back the Sanhedrin. It's like the Sanhedrin coming back from the dead. It's like the Sanhedrin coming back from the dead. For example, there is a party that is in alliance with the Likud Party. It's called Otzma Yehudit. Otzma Yehudit literally means Jewish power. That's what that means. The Jewish Power Party. Now, could you imagine a party being formed in the U.S. calling itself the White Power Party? And then the Republicans making a coalition with that faction? That's pretty much what the Likud is doing. It's making a coalition with the Jewish Power Party. Now, with the way things are going in the United States, with hyper identity politics becoming so strong, if something like that were to happen in the U.S., it actually wouldn't surprise me. If there ever was a faction in the future calling itself the White Power Party, it actually wouldn't surprise me, given how deeply we are entrenching ourselves into identity politics, right? Because it's like, oh, Black Lives Matter. Oh, well, if you want to say Black Lives Matter, then white lives matter. Okay, and well, what about Black Power? Oh, if you want to say Black Power, I'm going to say White Power. It's like this constant reactionaryism is bringing us deeper and deeper into identity politics. And the scary thing about identity politics is that it is one of the things that precede a civil war. Yeah, it's one of the things that precede a civil war. When people are so deep into hyper identitarianism and you have opposing factions, and these opposing factions are rooted in identity politics, and that identitarianism becomes extremely intense, and you add that to a bad economic situation or some kind of a catastrophe, well, then you have a very, very dangerous combination, one that is a sign of a coming civil conflict. So you look at Israel and you see on one side leftists and political moderates, and then on the other side you have ultra-nationalist and ultra-religious Jews, and both sides hate each other, but the fanatics, the nationalists, the religious fanatics, they are the ones who are growing in the highest numbers. They have the highest birth rates. And so their numbers are becoming so large, their presence is growing so much, that you can see it reflected in the political situation in Israel. And that's the reason why Netanyahu makes a coalition with people like that. Because, well, if you look at the birth rates, they're the future. If you look at the birth rates in Israel and the way it's going, you can project that, that's if the world is still going to exist in the deep future, but you can see that they are the future. The religion is kind of coming back. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but religion is making a comeback. I remember back in the early 2000s, there was this huge interest in atheism. I mean, a lot of people were becoming atheist, and atheism was trending. I remember, the days of Richard Dawkins and Hitchens, and Harris was pushing atheism, Sam Harris, and you had all these big names who were atheists, and there was a lot of debates that were going on between Christians and atheists, and you had Kirk Cameron and Ray Comfort, and they were debating atheists, and Ken Hovind, and there was this huge level of atheism that was going on in the United States. Well, I mean, the internet atheism has kind of died out, thank God for that, and religion is making a comeback. Now, is that going to be a good thing? Well, looking at how much nationalism is becoming a trend, it may not be a good thing. It may actually be quite a scary thing, because it may just be not a good revival in religion, but a Pharisaical revival in religion. And this is definitely the case in Israel. And you can see it in the government, the current government. The Likud party is the dominating party in Israel, but it has made itself even more dominating by making a coalition with Pharisaical political parties like Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power. Now, the guy who leads the Otzma Yehudit, his name is Ben Gvir, and Itamar Ben Gvir. And this guy, he doesn't just hate the Arabs. He also hates other Jews who are not like him. And he himself even said that he would deport Jews out of Israel who are deemed as actively going against the Jewish people and the state of Israel. Well, when he means the state of Israel, he means himself, because the other Jews the other Jews that he doesn't like, they're just as Israeli as he is, right? Technically speaking, they are just as Israeli as he is. But he's saying they're against the state of Israel. Well, what you're really saying is that they're against me, and the state of Israel is me. I am Israel. And if you look at some of the other people around Ben Gvir, they're pretty scary people. One of them is another guy. His name is Bensi Gopstein. Bensi Gopstein, he is a fanatic, and he says that he wants to burn down all the churches. Yeah, he wants to burn down all the churches, and he himself said that he is willing to serve time in prison for burning churches down. So it's not just against the Muslims, everyone. Everyone says, oh, they're against Islam. They're the good guys, right? It's not just against the Muslims. you guys, if you really believe that, if you really believe that these are the good guys and you are a Christian, then you're deceiving yourself. They also hate the Christians. It's not just the Muslims. It's not just, oh, they hate the Arabs. The Arabs are bad, guys. They hate Christians. And they hate Arab Christians. And they hate Muslim Christians. And they hate Western Christians, Eastern Christians, Greek Christians. They hate Armenians. Oh, they hate the Armenians. They harass the Armenians. And, well, they'll say, well, the reason why they hate Arabs is because the Arabs are terrorists. That's the reason why. No, they just hate people because they're not Jewish. That's the reason why. You don't have to be a terrorist. You don't have to be a part of a group of people that is greatly associated with terrorism. You just have to be non-Jewish, and they hate you. And that's why they harass Armenians. Armenians aren't terrorists. I've never heard of any Armenian terrorists in Israel walking around. I've never heard of Armenians doing suicide bombing in Israel any time. But they hate Armenians. Oh, yes, everybody. There is another party in Israel that's made an alliance with the Likud. It's called the Noam Party. And the Noam Party, they are a bunch of fanatics, and they literally want to make Israel into a theocracy. They want to make Israel into a theocracy. And there was this thing that happened a few years ago. The Likud Party actually, and this really goes to show just how much to the right the Likud Party has been going to. The Likud Party actually passed a bill banning Reformed Jewish converts from using the mikvahs, the public mikvahs in Israel. Now, a mikvah is a ritual bath. That's what a mikvah is. So they have these bathhouses in Israel. They're called mikvahs. They are religious bathhouses where people they observe the ritual of purification. They wash themselves in the bathhouse. So it's basically baptism, right? It's like the precursor to baptism. They have their own baptism. And the bathhouse that they use are called mikvahs. So in Israel, they have these public mikvahs where people can do the ritual washing. And in Israel, you have people who convert to Reformed Judaism. Now, there are two major schools of thought in Judaism. You have Orthodox Judaism, and that has its own sects and its own factions. And then you have Reformed Judaism. So think of it this way. Here's a really easy way as an American to picture this. Okay, you have Dennis Prager and you have Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro is Orthodox. He's an Orthodox Jew. He is a part of Orthodox Judaism. Dennis Prager is Reformed rabbi. So you have Prager and you have Ben Shapiro. So that's those two guys represent the two opposing sides of Judaism, like Sunni and Shiite, you have Protestant versus Catholic. Okay, in Judaism, you have Reformed versus Orthodox. Now, what's the difference between the two? I mean, Orthodox Jews, they have more traditional views, more traditional views on marriage. Reformed Jews are more lenient, and some of them are more lenient than others, depending on who you talk to. But they're more lenient when it comes to morals. So this is why, for example, you have Dennis Prager, who is a Reformed Jewish rabbi, saying things like, "Oh, I don't care if you're gay," and he hangs out with that Jewish right-wing guy, what's his name, Dave Rubin. He hangs out with David Rubin, and he says, "Oh, how did you meet your husband?" and blah blah blah. And so and that's because he's a Reformed Jew. So he's more liberal in his way of thinking. Even though in America he's considered to be a part of the right, he's actually very liberal. He's a very liberal person. And the thing that unites the two factions, there's one thing that unites the Reformed and the Orthodox, and that is that, well, they both reject Christ as the Messiah. And they would both, if a member of either faction decided to follow Christ as the Jewish Messiah, both factions would hate that person. And that's one thing about Israeli society, Jewish society in general, that is very, it's very strange. You can be an atheist and be considered Jewish. You can be a Buddhist and still be considered Jewish. The moment you say Jesus is the Messiah for the Jewish people, then everybody hates you. Because by following Christ, you are going against the Jewish identity. So you have two different opposing worldviews, two different opposing religious schools of thought, but they will both unite against a Jewish person who has decided to follow Christ as his rabbi, his eternal rabbi. But in Israel, you have people who convert to Reformed Judaism, and so they use the mikvahs. They use the public mikvahs as part of their baptism, so to speak. And I use that word, not in its traditional sense, obviously. Well, the Likud party passed a bill in the Knesset saying that it is prohibited for converts to Reform Judaism to use the public bathhouses, the public mikvahs, for their ritual purification. The Supreme Court intervened and said that's a bunch of bullcrap. Reform Jews can use the mikvahs, just like Orthodox Jews can use the mikvahs. Well, the right wing in Israel didn't like that, and you had this other guy who is tied with the Likud party. His name is Bezalel Smotrich. Now, Bezalel sounds like a Babylonian demon. It's that's what it sounds like. Sounds like something out of The Exorcist, like Pazuzu. But Bezalel didn't like that, and he basically said, "I don't really care about these fake Jews. These Reformed Jews are just fake Jews. They're not real Jews." And it's very interesting. This is the reason why they want to get rid of the Supreme Court. Now, the whole cultural battle, because right now Israel is in a physical war with Hamas. But before Israel got into this physical war with Hamas, Israel was in the middle of a political / cultural war. And there was a huge cultural war. And this culture war was happening at a time when people in Israel thought, okay, Hamas, they're kind of in the back burner. So this is basically what happens. If you put Hamas in the back burner in Israel and people aren't worried about Hamas or Islamic terrorism, they will start fighting each other. That's what that tells us. They will actually start fighting each other. So there was a cultural war going on in Israel, and the cultural war was centered on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has been the big point of contention in Israel. Why? Because the Supreme Court is the biggest obstacle to the creation of a Jewish theocracy. These people want to create a Jewish Sharia state. I call it kosheria. That's what they want. So they want to establish kosheria law. That's what they want to establish, kosheria law. And the Supreme Court is the biggest obstacle to kosheria law. Like, for example, the one I just brought up, right? They said no Reformed converts can use the public mikvahs. Supreme Court says no, it's a bunch of bullcrap. Another example of this is, they wanted to make it official law in Israel that you cannot bring in non-kosher foods into a hospital in Israel during the Passover season. They wanted to make this official law. Now, supposedly, they observed this rule already, but they wanted to put a stamp on it. Supreme Court came in and said, no, it's a bunch of bullcrap. And somebody, I think an Arab individual brought a case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court stood with the Arab. So the Supreme Court in Israel is the biggest hindrance to their aspiration of kosher Sharia law. Kosher law, okay? And that's why they hate the Supreme Court, and that's why the Supreme Court is at the center of the cultural war still really ongoing in Israel. Now, again, the cultural war was put in the back burner, but it's still there, still lingering about. It still has this underlying presence that's very strong. And once the Hamas war is over, it's going to come right back. And it's probably going to come back more viciously than before, because the political moderates in Israel who were protesting up to the kazoo against Netanyahu before the Hamas war erupted, they're already planning on what they're going to be doing. They're already planning for it. And they eventually want to do a revolution, an actual revolution. Which is why I say that eventually this cultural war is going to just escalate into a real violent confrontation. Again, what are some of the things that precede a civil war? You have some kind of a economic problem, you have a catastrophe of some sort that really shakes up the nation, but you also have hyper-identity politics. Hyper-identity politics, which is what's been going on in Israel, which actually has been going on in a lot of different countries, including the United States, which is pretty scary. But you have the two sides in Israel. And you have one side that says, no, keep Israel moderate. And you have the other side that says, no, 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 we got to bring back the Sanhedrin. We got to bring back the institution that murdered Christ. And if you go to the Noam Party, which is in a coalition with the Likud Party, the Noam Party, they are followers of a rabbi. There's a rabbi who is the spiritual ideologue for the party. His name is Zvi Tal, or Thal. I think it's Tal. Zvi Tal believes in establishing a Jewish kosher law state. So this is what's growing, and their numbers are growing. See, then this is what happens. This is what happens when you have secularization. When you have secularization, you have societal weakness. And Israel is a country that has been very secular for a very long time. And the secular people in Israel are weaker than the religious, the ultra-religious people in Israel. So you have the regular Israelis, they want to watch cat videos or whatever, and they don't want to have kids. They want to have, they want to have a dog and call it a baby, or a cat and call it a baby. And then you have the ultra-Orthodox who are having 13, 15 kids per family, 10 kids per family. Well, who's going to win? Not the people with the cat babies. People with the cat babies who are, filming the cat for Instagram, they're not going to win in the end. The ones who are going to win are the ones having 10, 15 kids per family. They're going to win the political war. Now, it may be that the secularists, secularists have dominated culture for a very long time in much of the world. You can see it here in the United States. But if they're not having kids, that's all very temporary. Who ultimately is going to win in the end? It's the people who have kids. The ones who have children are the ones who win the war. The ones who have the most kids are the ones who win. Secularization leads to people who just want to focus on their own individual lives. They want to focus. They're hyper-individualists. They don't really care about collectivism. They're repulsed by the very idea of collectivism. And they don't want to really have kids. They want to just have fun. And people say, well, people don't have kids because they can't afford children. How come poor people are having more kids? Answer me that question. Poor people tend to have more kids than rich people. It's the people who are well off who aren't having kids. It's the people who just live their nice, comfortable lives. They're not having children. So what happens? They start dying, because life is just what? It's the race towards death at the end of the day. Well, it's not a race, but it's like a walk towards death, right? It's the journey to death. That's what life is, ultimately speaking. Well, not ultimately. Ultimately, it's the afterlife. But, tragically enough, life is just you dying. We're all dying, right? As Proximo said in Gladiator, we are all dead men. And the ones who have the most kids are the ones who are going to win the future. And that's what's happening in Israel. The ultra-religious, the people who want to bring back the Sanhedrin, they are dominating. And so what eventually is going to happen? The moderates, the leftists, they see themselves in an existential crisis, and they see Israel in an existential crisis. The Israel that they want to keep is being seized by fanatics. So what are they going to do? Eventually, this conflict is going to erupt into a physical, violent confrontation. And that war that took place after the crucifixion of Christ, it's going to happen again. That civil war, because it's not just the Roman Jewish war, it's the Jewish civil war that took place in the midst of that conflict. That's all coming back. All that stuff is coming back. So, and you have people who hate Christ, who hate Christianity, and they want to destroy Christianity in Israel. They want to destroy any remnant of Christianity that's left in Israel. They want to destroy all of the churches. They hate Christmas. They hate Christ. And that way of thinking is huge in Israel. And it's growing. So we celebrate Christmas, which is the birth of Christ, but let's also keep in mind that history repeats. History repeats. And the Jewish civil war that occurred after the crucifixion of Christ, well, that's all coming back in its own way. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.